I I have a I have a message that I I'm assuming this will affect everybody. I don't know for sure that you have had an experience like this, but I think most of us have had a time in which we have been um, let down by somebody that maybe held a spiritual role, somebody that would have been maybe a preacher or um, someone that we looked up to. Uh, I'll tell you my personal little experience. Really, the reason why I came up with this lesson was when I guess most of you know this. I don't have any Amish or Mennonite background. Me and my wife were both public schooled. We were raised in Christian homes, but not really. We didn't really have anybody around us in our family or in the churches that had a lot of kids, and really nobody that even had kids seemed like they were doing a good job of raising their kids. They were not training them. They were unruly, and we both that was the thing we kind of were unified in. We found a great unity in when we were dating and getting married was that we wanted to do different than what we had saw around us. We were seeing that the rule was the children were going astray, not remaining faithful, and we felt like that shouldn't be the rule, that should be the exception. So we were looking around kind of for examples because they weren't in the churches that we were in. And my wife actually saw on TV, we're both raised, watching TV all the time. And so she saw this show about the Duggars. And I don't know how many of you even know who that is, but there was the Duggars. And we saw this show, and she was really impressed by that. And she told me about it, and we saw it. And they did. They had all kinds of kids. They were well mannered. They were conservatively dressed at the time, and they were a good influence, and we really appreciated what they the example that they set. And then we've got these scandals, and again, I don't know how much of you know this, but they've had a little bit of scandals with a couple of their sons, bad stuff, and the tendency is to get let down, right? Like we see that, we especially when it's someone that did have an influence on you. And again, I don't know that everybody in here has that, but I think most of us have been let down by some other person. Maybe it was just in the fact that when you saw the gospel and told it to somebody else or knew somebody else was hearing it like you did and they didn't receive it, maybe you was let down in that. Maybe you thought someone was more upright than what they was, and they let you down in that. Maybe someone, in fact, I've had an experience or two in which someone let me down that I don't think they were trying to, right? They weren't trying to discourage me. They weren't trying to let me down, but something they said discouraged me or, was had a negative impact on what I thought to be true or right or whatever it was. So I think most of us have some sort of experience in which we were let down by someone. In fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a verse here that I think is very fitting to this. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 16 says this. He says, "And moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment," like literally the judge, he's looking around maybe at the high priest or the people that would sit at the gate of the city and judge a matter or whatever. He says, "I looked in the place of judgment that wickedness was there." Right? Like he goes to the place that ought to be making a right decision, ought to be making the right call, and he looks in that position, that high upheld position, and there's wickedness there. He says, "And the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there." So, I mean, again, I think we see that. We see anytime that there's a scandal about a preacher or someone that is held to be held to be a righteous man, and we see something come out that is maybe some kind of scandal or whatever, we look in that place where it ought to have been holiness and righteousness, and there winds up being wickedness there. Right? So Solomon is looking at this. He's seeing in the positions in which it ought to be truth and righteousness and holiness upheld, that he finds, maybe not all the time. I mean, it's true, like all these scandals maybe that we see, they're not necessarily the rule. They may be the exception, but we see them exceptions, and it disappoints us. So, and I may say this again, but here's kindly the point that I want to make to you tonight. We often measure God's faithfulness based on the faithfulness of men, right? So we may look at something and we may say that we look at this individual that ought to have been righteous, that ought to have been a holy person. We see them fall in their faithfulness, and we relate that in our minds to God must not be faithful. So that's what I really want to address tonight, is the fact that we make that mistake in which we put so much stock into men that we basically judge the faithfulness of God based on the faithfulness of another man. So we realize, I mean, this is a set of verses that I used to read and think was only about the bad people, but Romans chapter 3, and starting in verse 9, he says this is Romans 3 and verse 9, and actually the context of this is very important to the argument, because he's basically, if you know Romans very well, you know that Paul starts out by telling us how that people that did not acknowledge God turned to these things, all these bad things, and God turned them over to more and more wickedness as they refused to acknowledge God. And then he turns around after saying a big list in the end of chapter 1 of great sins that people do, and we're all quick to condemn it. We all see that list, and we all think that's the other people. And he turns around in chapter 2 and says, the things that you just made a judgment call on, you do the same things. He turns around and he addresses in chapter 2 how that the Jew, which should have been a light to the world, which should have known God's words, he is supposed to be the one that's guiding and is a example to other people. And he says, you condemn this, but do you do the same thing? Right? And then he comes into chapter 3 and he is comparing those two things, the Gentile which knew not God and the Jew which should have known God. And he says in verse 9, this is Romans 3:9, he says, what then? Are we better than they? That is the Jew better than the Gentile? No, in no wise, for we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. As it is written, listen to this list. And like I said, I used to think this was everybody else. I mean, honestly, I did. Because I felt like I was doing more than most. I mean, I'll be honest, I did. I felt like that before I saw the gospel. I felt like I was trying harder than most. So when I read this list, I applied it to the bad people, right? But listen to what he says. He says, this is Romans 3 and verse 10, as it is written, there is none righteous. No, not one. He says, there is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together, that is, as a whole, become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, listen to this, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. Right? So I kind of read that really to say this, that we see, or we are let down when we see people fall from what they have appeared to be. But in another sense, we shouldn't be surprised, right? In another sense, we shouldn't be shocked when we see great wickedness come out where we were looking for justice and righteousness and we found iniquity. We shouldn't be surprised, right? He's making this conclusion about humanity, of how wicked we are and how we've all gone astray. I mean, he says we're like sheep, all gone away, gone after our own ways. So in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised. But the danger that I keep wanting to stress to you is, if you look at the man or the woman and you equate their unfaithfulness as unfaithfulness of God, then you're missing it, right? I mean, that you're basing this on what man has done, not what God has done. In fact, let's look at something that Solomon said in 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. This is Solomon is just kind of been dedicating the temple and build it there and all the things that go along with putting it together and all the riches that get in it. And he makes this comment. This is 1 Kings 8 and verse 56. 1 Kings 8 and verse 56, he makes this comment. He says, "Blessed be the Lord that hath given rest unto his people Israel." Now listen to this. "According to all that he promised, there hath not failed one word of all his good promise, which he promised by the hand of Moses, his servant." Now, let's think about that story. Let's think about their history from Abraham, or well, not really from Abraham. Let's take it from Exodus up to the present here in 1 Kings. They've got a history of unbelief, right? I mean, that's what Hebrews tells us, that the people that were 20 years old and upward, other than Caleb and Joshua, they failed to enter into the promised land because of unbelief. So they've got a history of unbelief. They've got a history of disobedience. But God has a history of doing everything that he promised, right? He promises them, he says, "I'm going to feed you with manna. I'm going to send you meat by quail." And regardless of their unfaithfulness, that doesn't stop, does it? Right? So Solomon here can stand up and say, he doesn't say all this, but he could say, now we have failed God. We have fallen short of what our requirement was to believe these promises, but God, not one word of what he has promised has failed, right? So regardless of what this people did, I mean, that's what Jesus says about them. They're a stiff-necked people. How many times would I have gathered you together as a chick doth gather, her chicks under her wings, and ye would not? They were very unfaithful. But God did not fail in one word that he had promised, right? So as you look, I mean, again, we could take that same story, look back. When they did what God said, when he promised them that if they would march around the walls of Jericho 7 times, it would fall. When they did that, it fell, right? When he says you can go over there and you can take the land of the giants, and the spies come back and say, no, they're too big for us, God's promise was faithful. When they actually did go do that, they was able to do it. But when they doubted, they failed. Now, if you want to, let's go back to Romans. Again, back to Romans chapter 3. Romans 3. We read the last part of that chapter, but let's go back to the beginning of that chapter. Romans chapter 3. And again, like I said, he's just got done saying that the that the name of God is blasphemed through among the Gentiles through the Jews, because the Jews would condemn a certain thing and yet do it themselves. That's what he said back in Romans 2:24. And he comes to chapter 3 and he says this, "What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way." Like, he's in the midst of concluding them in the same chapters we just already read. He's going to conclude they're all under sin, but he's making the point, is there an advantage to being a Jew, to being someone that God had already dealt with, that already knew the stories of who God was, that already had his laws, that already had a understanding of who he was, knew what the promises was informed on all the prophecies that pertain to them? Is there an advantage in that? He says, yes, absolutely. In every way there is an advantage to that. He says in verse 2, "Much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God." But now listen to this, and I want you to think about the context. He's comparing Jew to Gentile. He says, is there an advantage to the Jew because of what I just said? Them knowing the promises, them telling the stories of how their fathers saw the miracles, how their fathers were brought out of the wilderness, how they watched the great works of God and saw all those things he did. They knew all these things, right? They did kind of fail in this, but they were prepared in the sense of the information they had and the history they had. They were prepared to know what was coming, right, when Jesus comes on scene. Okay, he says, if that's the case, verse 3, "For what if some did not believe?" In other words, they have all this information, but what if when it comes, which is actually really what happened, when it comes, what if most of them, or what if all of them, don't believe it, right? What if Jesus comes on the scene? They know he's coming. They have all these prophecies leading up to him. They know that God has promised to send a Messiah. Well, what if when he shows up, nobody believes him? Listen to what he says. "For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect?" Here's what he's saying. If this people that knows all his words and all his promises, if when one of them, like his son showing up on the scene, happens, and they fail to believe it, does that mean that the promises are of none effect? Right? Listen to what he says in the next verse. "God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and that thou mightest overcome when thou art judged." Right? So, God, in fact, you could look at it this way. God has already said they're going to have a blind eye and a hard heart, and they're not going to receive this. So God knows that though they have the advantage, they're going to reject this son, right? Well, if their actions, like if we were looking around, if we were on the outside, let's just say that the Gentile had the understanding. Let's say he looks at the situation and says, well, nobody is believing this. Does that make it ineffectual? And here's my point. The people that have let us down, the people that have seemed true and ended up false, is that a mark against God or against that man? Right? Who's that a mark against? Who does that say that the unfaithfulness is in? It's not in God. It didn't. Just like this story right here. If nobody believed it, and if you look at the percentage, it was a small percentage, even though the first several thousand true believers came out of Israel. It's still a small percentage of the amount of people that there was that was Israelites, right? So their lack of belief does not make the promises of God without effect. Now, let's turn over, if you would, to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. He says this, 2 Timothy 2:12. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. Listen to this. If we believe not, yet he abideth faithful. He cannot deny himself. Now, folks, it doesn't matter what science or anybody else comes up with. It doesn't matter if this whole nation turns against God and we all become atheists and we all believe in evolution. It doesn't matter, right? God is still true. He's still the creator. Regardless of what we conclude, regardless of what man comes up with. I mean, think about the verse. If we believe not, yet he abideth faithful. You cannot base your assessment of God's faithfulness on what man does. They'll let you down, right? I mean, I have said that many times. Men will let you down. They just will. I mean, you're not, if you are, and like I said, I don't know, maybe not, but I think that we have a tendency to look at a man, a man that we may look up to or a woman that we may look up to, and we hold them higher than we ought to. And then they say something or they do something or they don't act like we think they ought to act, and it shakes our faith, right? I mean, has that happened to us? We see someone do something and it shakes our faith and we feel like maybe God, maybe he's not who he says he is, because I never thought this person would do that. Folks, if we believe not, if they believe not, he still abides faithful, right? He cannot deny himself. It's like, I mean, I understand that maybe our thinking would be that this is impossible. Like, I think that it's almost impossible if you read your Bible that this would happen. But it is true that it doesn't matter. Let's say the whole world turned against him and there was not a believer left. It doesn't make the truth of the Bible and of God any less, right? It doesn't make any difference. It is not affected how true or how real God is if no one believes that he's real. It doesn't make any difference. Now, go back to chapter 1. This is 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12. And I want you to think about this. And I want you to kind of put yourself, I'm going to read part of this and then we're going to go back and look at something else in just a second. But I want you to put yourself in Paul's situation or in his perspective. Paul makes this comment to Timothy. 2 Timothy 1:12, he says this, for the which cause, that is, for the cause of preaching the gospel, I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed. Now, I'm going to read the rest of the verse in just a second, but I want you to think about what what does he mean by that? Turn back, hold your finger right there, and turn back to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and we kind of talked about this a little bit last night when the men were gathered around here. Not these verses, but we talked about this concept of what if bad things happen to me? What if great misfortunes fall upon me or something bad happens or whatever? How am I to think of this? Now, we were talking about something like a trailer, pulling a trailer down the road and it coming unhooked and causing us maybe a lawsuit or whatever. But I want you to think about what Paul's situation was. This is 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 23 in comparison to something that light. Listen to this. He says, 2 Corinthians 11:23, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. Now, I want you to, Paul just said there in 2 Timothy, I suffer these things and I'm not ashamed. I mean, what would you think if you were preaching the gospel, if you were saying God is real, if you were saying He's the Savior of the world, if you were preaching His Son's death, burial, and resurrection, and over again so that you lost count, you got beat for that? Would that shake your faith? If you were striped so many times, I mean, I don't think this is an exaggeration. He says stripes above measure. I have lost count of the licks I have taken for preaching the gospel. Stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent. I mean, you're out here doing what God told you to do, and you keep getting thrown in jail. He says in deaths oft. Like maybe some of us, or maybe most of us, have had an instance where we felt like we were close to death, but it was just like, you're driving down the road and somebody swerves over and you swerve out of the way at the last minute and you say, oh my, I was so close to death. He's not talking about accidents. He's saying that I was in jeopardy to the point of I had a face-to-face death experience for the gospel's sake. And often, right? Several times. He says in 24, of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. He said, in fact, just of the Jews alone, I've got beat 5 times with 39 stripes. He says, thrice, that is 3 times, I was beaten with rods, like they laid him down. They did not give him what I see some people give their kids, just a love tap, like, oh, don't do that, I mean, they laid him down and they were beating him with a rod, right? Like a strong man is swinging a rod and beating him with it. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep, like he has a shipwreck and he has to float around wondering if he's going to get eaten by a shark for a day and a half, right? He says, in journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst. That's not saying I ate breakfast and I had to wait till 9 o'clock that night to eat supper. That's not what he's saying, right? Like real hunger, like real starvation and thirst. He says, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. He said, on top of all that physical suffering, I've got this fire to put out over here at Corinth. I've got this going on over here at Galatia. I've got this going on over here at Philippi, right? I mean, I'm worried about what's going on, what's being taught over here. I've got these brethren coming behind me trying to teach people that they need to go back and obey the law of Moses. I've got all this coming on me, right? I mean, think about that. He's going through all this physical pain and suffering for it, and then on top of that, he's got trouble in most of the churches that's bothering him. But go back to 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12. He says, I'll read the whole verse this time. For the which cause I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I'm not ashamed. Right? Like, it doesn't matter how many times I get beat for the gospel's sake. It doesn't really matter how many problems there is over here in the churches or how many false doctrines are going around from place to place. I'm not ashamed. Listen to this. For I know whom I have believed. Now, folks, if all you know if the only person you know and the only way you are measuring the faithfulness of God is by another man, then you're going to get discouraged. But if you know God, if you go back and read these stories and you learn who he really is, you'll be like Paul and you'll say, I know him, right? I know whom I believed. He says, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. He said, it really doesn't matter what's going on around me. I know God. I know how faithful he is. I know that that's true, that there's not been one word fail of all his promises, like Solomon said. I know him. In the last verse, turn over to Romans 4. I'm tempted to read the whole definition of what Abraham was, but I actually just want to read this one verse. This is Romans 4 and verse 21. This is an explanation of what he means when he says that Abraham was a great man of faith, or that Abraham was the father of faith. This is a good definition, and it goes right along with what we just said about Paul. He says this is talking about Abraham. He started telling what this definition of what Abraham did, starting in verse 18. But in 21, he makes this comment. This is Romans 4:21. He says about Abraham that he was being fully persuaded that what he, that is God, had promised, he, that is God, was able also to perform. Now, folks, if you base God's performance on the performance of me or anybody else, you're going to be let down. But if you read about God and you see his faithfulness and his keeping of his promises, forget about man. Just look at the faithfulness of God, right? Don't be discouraged. And I don't know how much that it personally affected me when I saw that, when I see something, I'm looking for righteousness and I find iniquity in that. It did affect me. And this is what I thought. I mean, I had to go back and evaluate it like this. So if you have had, in fact, that may keep someone from believing the gospel because they look at the unfaithfulness of a man and they doubt God's faithfulness. In other words, you see someone that maybe had a great influence on you and they turn out to be not what you thought, or they don't believe the gospel, and you let that hang you up on believing the truth of God. And it's a stumbling block to you. I say, forget about the man. Look at God. Look at his faithfulness. Put your confidence in his ability to perform what he has promised, because, I'll say it again, man will let you down. I don't care if it's me or whoever it is. I'll let you down. But God does not fail. So I hope that's been an encouragement to you. I hope that'll put our focus in the right place. But appreciate your attention.